In a previous video, I explained how Matoaka, commonly known as Pocahontas, and John Rolfe had only one child named Thomas Rolfe, who married Jane Poitras. Thomas Rolfe and his wife Jane also had only one child named Jane Rolfe, who married Robert Bolling, who was the son of John Bolling and Mary Carey, born at All Hallows Barking Parish in London, England in 1646. Robert Bolling, the first Bolling to come over to Virginia from England, and Jane Rolfe had only one child named John Bolling. John Bolling, like his father, was a member of the House of Burgesses for many years representing Henrico County. He married Mary Kennan and had several children, continuing the family lineage of his great-grandmother, Matoaka. Like other prominent Virginia families at the time, he owned slaves on his plantation called Cobbs. In this video, I'm going to go over his descendants as far as possible based on wills. To begin, each of his children married. Unfortunately, I do not have wills or deeds to prove the relationship to some of the descendants. Nevertheless, I will illustrate the family line based on what I do have. You'll notice for most of the names on this family tree that they are not typed out but look like they were written by hand. That is because they are. I thought it would be really cool and more honest for these individuals if I used cut out forms of their names from the wills done by their father or mother. So when you see the names for John Bolling and Mary Kennan's children, these come directly from his actual will. The idea behind this is to make these people feel more real and make them come to life. The same goes for their children. The names you see look written and somewhat tough to read as from the original document itself. I also don't go by grave dates. Instead, I go by the date listed on the will for the person's death. This isn't to suggest that grave dates are not valuable or cool to look at because they do represent the person in their past. However, there are inaccuracies on those dates, and I have joined a couple of lineage societies, and I can tell you from that experience of collecting primary source documents to track my ancestors that graves are not as acceptable as you might think in proving your family line. For this reason, I am approaching John Rolfe and Matoaka's descendancy the same way I would if I was proving my ancestry back to them. As mentioned in the previous video, I am not a descendant of those two, but all these descendants are my distant cousins due to our common ancestor, Robert Bolling. John Bolling would be my 6th great half-uncle. I hope that exists as a genealogy label. With that being said, I am going to start with John Bolling's daughter Mary, who married John Fleming, and work my way across from left to right. So his daughter Mary married John Fleming. The reason John Fleming's name also looks written is because he is mentioned in John Bolling's will as Mr. John Fleming. Sadly, I don't have his will or any deeds to prove that they had children except for Elizabeth Bolling's will, in which it says, I constitute and appoint my sons-in-law Thomas Bolling and Neil Buchanan and my nephew John Fleming executors of this my last will. Due to her sibling relationship with her sister Mary Bolling and sharing the same parents John Bolling and Mary Kennan, this confirms a documented child for John Fleming and Mary Bolling. Next is John Bolling and Mary Kennan's daughter Martha Bolling, who married Thomas Eldridge. I have not found a will for either of these two online, so you may be wondering how I know that they had a child named Bolling Eldridge. So John Bolling and Mary Kennan had a son named John Bolling, named after his father. This was very common among prominent families who took honor in their family name in relationship to their bloodline. This John Bolling wrote a will dated September 4th, 1749, and he continues, which I give and dispose of in manner following, that is to say, I give and devise, to my nephew, Bolling Eldridge. Because he mentions Bolling Eldridge as his nephew, that would confirm his sibling relationship with his sister Martha Bolling, since he and Martha both came from the same parents, John Bolling and Mary Kennan. This brings us to Jane Bolling, who married Richard Randolph. They did in fact have children. But I'm saving this for the end of the video because there is something very unique about this family line when it combines later on. Next, we have Elizabeth Bolling, whose will is dated August 12, 1764, and her husband William Gay, whose dates March 1st, 1749. She created a will after his death since she survived him by more than 10 years. In William Gay's will, he doesn't mention his children at all, but his wife's will does. Elizabeth Bolling writes, I, Elizabeth Gay of Chesterfield County, I give and bequeath to my daughters Betty Bolling and to my daughter Mary Buchanan, each the sum of £100 current money to be paid them within 1 year after my decease. I give and devise to my said daughter Mary and her heirs my 2 Negro men slaves, old Frank and young Joe, and do confirm to my sons-in-law, Mr. Thomas Bolling and Neil Buchanan, the right and title into the several slaves of which I have severally possessed them as part of their wives' portions. I give and devise to my son John Gay my tract of land in Chesterfield County called Auburn Chase, with 10 slaves. I give and devise to my son William Gay and his heirs forever my tract of land in Cumberland County, containing by estimation 1,612 acres, and all the rest of my slaves. I constitute and appoint my sons-in-law Thomas Bolling and Neil Buchanan and my nephew John Fleming executors of this my last will, this 12th day of August in the year 1764. She also had a codicil which said, I give and devise to my granddaughter Elizabeth Bolling and to her heirs a Negro girl, daughter of Hester, named Nanny, to my daughter Mary Buchanan, and to her heirs Phyllis, a Negro girl, daughter of Sarah. Betty Bolling, daughter of Elizabeth Bolling and William Gay, married Thomas Bolling. If you are wondering if they are cousins, they indeed are. Thomas Bolling is mentioned as a son-in-law in the will of Elizabeth Bolling, confirming their marriage relationship. Thomas Bolling, the husband of Betty Bolling, is a son of John Bolling and Elizabeth Bland. Because Betty and Thomas share the same ancestors, John Bolling and Mary Kennan, this makes them cousins. To be more precise, Betty's mother Elizabeth is the daughter of John Bolling and Mary Kennan. Elizabeth's brother is John Bolling. When your parent has a sibling, they are called aunts and uncles. Therefore, Betty's uncle is John Bolling II. When your uncle or aunt has children, they are called cousins. This would mean that Betty married her first cousin Thomas, since they came from the same generation. This type of marriage was not unusual at the time. Many families married into one another. Continuing on, Thomas Bolling of Cobbs' will dates August 5th, 1804. His will states as follows, I, Thomas Bolling of Cobbs, in the county of Chesterfield, I give and devise to my beloved wife Betty Bolling during her natural life all my lands and tenements in the county of Chesterfield, and for use of all my Negroes, stock, household, and kitchen furniture, except my black walnut desk. He also mentions his estate, known formerly by the name of Licking Hole, now called Bolling Hall, and his island called Bolling's Island. I presume that he called his estate Bolling Hall in reference to deep ancestry back to England. The Bollings descend from the Bollings who were affiliated with Bolling Hall, dating back to the 1400s. Perhaps I will do a video on these ancestral roots in England, since they were my ancestors as well. He goes on to mention his son Thomas Bolling, who gets his black walnut desk. He also includes his son William Bolling. He also mentions his daughter Elizabeth Robertson, but does not mention her husband. But we know that she married a man named Robertson, and she was given the slaves named Betty, daughter of Phyllis, and her 4 children, Betsy, Jenny, Davy, commonly called Davy, and Littleton, and then a mention of his granddaughters Betsy and Mary Robertson, who received 2 maids, Janet and Sally. Based on the last name of both of his granddaughters, they were the daughters of Elizabeth Bolling and the unknown Robertson. He then states his daughter Rebecca Murray and the slaves he gave, namely the following, Chloe, Lukey, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, and her 3 children Lucy, Nancy, and Maria. As with his daughter Elizabeth Robertson, his daughter Rebecca Bolling married an unknown man named Murray, most likely another cousin-oriented marriage. To my daughter Mary Bolling, my Negro girl queen, daughter of Sally. As a side note, Seeing the signature or seal in such a design is definitely aesthetically pleasing. The swirls and the movement of the signature is fascinating. My signature does not look anywhere near as aesthetically pleasing as my cousin's does. Next, we have Anne Bolling, who married James Murray. Due to his last name, I assume that Rebecca Bolling married one of his descendants. However, I have no evidence to prove this. Then we come to John Bolling, who took his father's name. I have no documentation or research to prove that he and his first wife, Elizabeth Lewis, had children. His second marriage to Elizabeth Bland produced several children. In his will, dated September 4th, 1749, he states, "I give and devise unto my loving wife, Elizabeth Bolling." Also the use of 6 Negroes named Lucy, Austin, Tony, Jug, maybe Jug, sorry if I mispronounce it, Sue, and Betty. He then mentions his son Thomas Bolling, his son John Bolling, Robert Bolling, and Edward Bolling. As you can see, the use of names Thomas in reference to his great-grandfather Thomas Rolfe, continuing the name John in reference to his father John Bolling, who married Mary Kennan, and the name Robert in reference to his grandfather Robert Bolling. And last, Edward Bolling. Edward Bolling was the name of Robert Bolling's brother, Robert Bolling meaning the one who married Jane Rolfe. He continues in his will, mentions his daughters Mary Bolling and Sarah Bolling, with a mention of their aunt Whiting. Sorry if I mispronounced that. In his codicil, he mentions his son Archibald Bolling. At the end of his codicil, he mentions his daughter Anne. I would argue that her name is in reference to Robert Bolling's second wife, Anne Stith. Further down, we come to Archibald Bolling, whose will is dated January 23, 1846. If I'm not mistaken, he married twice and both wives were named Sarah. In his will, he writes, "I, Archibald Bolling." He then mentions my beloved wife, Sarah. He goes and says, "I give to my daughter Sarah Megginson, I give to my daughter Anne E. Cable, to be equally divided between my 2 sons, John R. Bolling and Blair Bolling, my 2 granddaughters, Pocahontas A. Robertson and Virginia Robertson, of their mother, my late daughter, Elizabeth M. Robertson." As a notable side note, John Bolling, son of John Bolling, married Martha Jefferson, who was the sister of the main architect of the Declaration of Independence. Thus, their children would be nephews of President Thomas Jefferson and descendants of John Rolfe and Matoaka. Finally, we make our way to the unique family line of Richard Randolph of Curls and Jane Bolling. Both of them made wills. In Richard Randolph's will, dated November 18, 1747, he mentions, "To wife Jane, the same amongst my 4 sons, Richard, Brett, Ryland, and John Randolph." He goes on to mention 3 daughters, Mary, Jane, and Elizabeth. He then mentions his granddaughters, Anne Carey and Mary Carey, a Negro apiece, and lists Mr. Archibald Carey as an executor. In his wife's will, Jane Bolling, she writes, "I, Jane Randolph of Curls." Later in her will, she says, "I lent to my niece Jane Eldridge." She then goes on at the end of her will and talks about her siblings, Elizabeth Gay and Anne Murray, confirming the relationship. Archibald Carey married Richard Randolph and Jane Bolling's daughter, Mary Randolph. Together they had several children, including Anne Carey, who is mentioned as a granddaughter in Richard Randolph of Curls' will. In Archibald Carey's will, he states, "I give and devise to my son-in-law Archibald Bolling and to his wife Jane. I give and devise to my said grandson Archibald Carey Bolling, my son-in-law Carter Page, and to his wife Mary. To my granddaughter Mary Randolph, daughter of the aforesaid Thomas Randolph, agreeable to the request of my deceased wife, the sum of 300 pounds current money. My daughter Anne Randolph, her eldest surviving son, my grandson Archibald Carey Randolph. And in case he be dead, his brother Isham and Thomas, or the survivor of them, and if they are both dead, their sister Mary Randolph, my grandson, Archibald Carey Bolling, my daughter Betty, and my daughter Mary Page." He then creates a codicil and says, "I give and devise to my daughter Anne Randolph and her heirs, and assigns my faithful servant named Aggie, all the Negroes which I have hereunto given her together, now in possession of my said daughter, under her or her husband, my son-in-law, Thomas Mann Randolph." Archibald Carey and Mary Randolph's daughter, and Carey married Thomas Mann Randolph. They had a son named Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. He eventually became governor of Virginia. He also married Martha Jefferson, daughter of President Thomas Jefferson and Martha Wales. Martha Jefferson and Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. had descendants. The uniqueness of this family line is that the descendants of Thomas Mann Randolph Jr. and Martha Jefferson are not only descendants of President Thomas Jefferson and his wife Martha Wales, but they are also descendants of John Rolfe and Matoaka. This ends my research on the lines of John Rolfe and Matoaka. If you found it useful, give the video a like.